Teenage couple vanished camping. Months later, strange evidence found at abandoned tent. Before we start, tell us, where are you listening from? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Now, let's dive into this intense and chilling tale. A teenage couple told their parents they were headed to a popular campground, but instead drove into Vermont's remote wilderness for a secret weekend getaway. For 3 agonizing months, their families had no answers as the trail went completely cold. Then, a state contractor stumbled upon their abandoned campsite and found an unusual empty candy wrapper that would prove to be the start of a much darker mystery. One that involved more than just 2 lost teenagers. Before we start, tell us, where are you listening from? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Now, let's dive into this intense and chilling tale. The humidity in the Green Mountain National Forest wasn't just air. It was a heavy, damp weight pressing down on Sharon Conincade as the last vestiges of daylight faded on Sunday, September 16, 2018. Her son, 17-year-old Rhett Conincade, and his girlfriend, Odessa Vance, also 17, were overdue, not by minutes, but by hours. The weekend camping trip had been a negotiation. Odessa's mother, Jacqueline Vance, had been hesitant. The idea of the young couple spending a night alone in the woods unsettled her. But Rhett, with his easy confidence and experience in the outdoors, had assured both sets of parents they were heading to a popular, well-staffed campground, a place teeming with families and park rangers. Eventually, Jacqueline had relented. Sharon, trusting her son implicitly, had agreed readily. Now, calls to both Rhett's and Odessa's cell phones met an immediate electronic dead end, straight to voicemail. In the patchy service areas of Vermont's mountains, this wasn't immediately catastrophic. But as the afternoon wore into evening, the lack of contact became ominous. By 6 p.m., the anxiety tightening in Sharon's chest became unbearable. She had to act. She decided to drive out to the campground, envisioning a flat tire, a dead battery, a simple explanation. The drive was dark and winding, the roads occasionally slick from recent rain. When Sharon arrived at the campground entrance, the check-in booth was staffed, the end of the busy season approaching. She approached the park ranger on duty, her voice strained as she explained the situation. The ranger, accustomed to the anxieties of parents, calmly checked the registration logs. He scanned the names, then scanned them again. Rhett Conincade wasn't there. Odessa Vance wasn't there. They had never checked in. Sharon insisted, her voice rising slightly. Perhaps they had arrived late. Perhaps they bypassed registration. She drove the loops of the campground herself, her headlights sweeping across the campsites, searching for Rhett's familiar older model Jeep. It wasn't there. No tent, no campfire, no sign of them at all. The realization was a physical blow. Rhett and Odessa had lied. They had intentionally gone somewhere else. If they weren't here, where were they? Vermont's wilderness is vast, rugged, and even in September, unpredictable. Returning to her car, Sharon frantically reviewed her last contact with her son. It was a text message received Friday afternoon. It contained a single image, a selfie taken close up. Rhett, wearing his glasses, a maroon hoodie, and a dark vest, smirked slightly at the camera. Beside him was Odessa, her long blonde hair spilling out from under a cream-colored knit beanie that matched hers. Their warm clothing seemed appropriate for the cooler mountain evenings. Behind them were rough, uneven earth walls, suggesting they were inside a shallow cave or rock shelter. The message was brief. Heading out now. See you Sunday. That photo was now the last known proof of their existence. By 9 p.m., the Conincades and the Vances converged at the local police station. The discrepancy between the teenagers' stated plans and their complete absence immediately escalated the situation. Rhett Conincade and Odessa Vance were officially reported missing. The deception meant the search area wasn't a contained campground. It was potentially hundreds of square miles of trackless wilderness, and the search was starting blind. The initial mobilization by the Vermont State Police was swift, driven by the age of the missing persons and the unpredictability of the early autumn weather. The first 48 hours were critical. Search and rescue teams, hampered by intermittent rain and the dense late summer foliage, concentrated their efforts around the Green Mountain National Forest campground. It was the logical starting point, the place they were supposed to be. Volunteers and professionals alike combed the dense woods, their calls echoing unanswered. K-9 units were deployed, attempting to pick up a scent trail, but the damp air and the vastness of the terrain made tracking difficult. The search operated under the assumption that they had perhaps parked nearby and hiked in, even if they hadn't registered. But as the first day turned into the second and then the third, it became painfully clear that the assumption was wrong. Rhett's Jeep was not found in any nearby parking areas or pull-offs. The couple had never been anywhere near the campground. Investigators attempted to ping their cell phones, hoping for a digital breadcrumb. The data confirmed the silence. Both phones had lost connection with the network shortly after they left their hometown on Friday afternoon. The last signals were geographically useless, offering no clues as to the direction they had traveled after sending the selfie. The digital trail had gone cold. With the physical search yielding nothing but exhaustion and frustration, the investigation shifted focus. If Rhett and Odessa had intentionally deceived their parents, they must have had a specific alternate destination in mind. The question was how they planned this secret trip and where they intended to go. The selfie offered few clues. The rock shelter background could have been anywhere in Vermont, a state riddled with similar geological features. Police began extensive interviews with the couple's friends, looking for any hint of their plans, any whispered secret. They were looking for someone Rhett might have confided in. The breakthrough came not from a friend, but from an unlikely source during a routine canvass of extended family members, Rhett's uncle, Barry Conincade. Barry mentioned something in passing that immediately caught the investigators' attention. Rhett had recently developed a keen interest in serious backcountry trekking and survivalism, moving beyond the casual camping of his youth. About a week before the trip, Rhett had asked to borrow Barry's specialized handheld GPS unit. It wasn't a typical car GPS, but an older, rugged Garmin model designed for use far from cell service, the kind used by hunters and serious hikers to navigate deep wilderness by satellite synchronization. Barry hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming Rhett wanted it as a backup for their trip to the Green Mountain campground. He had handed it over without question, even showing Rhett how to upload new maps. Investigators immediately realized the potential significance of this device. While the GPS unit itself was missing with Rhett, there was a chance it held data about their intended route. If Rhett had programmed coordinates or uploaded maps, that information might still exist elsewhere. They asked Barry where Rhett would have loaded information onto the device. Barry explained that the unit needed to be physically connected via USB to a computer. Rhett had used Barry's home computer for this purpose. A team of digital forensic examiners was dispatched to Barry Conincade's house. The atmosphere was tense as they powered up the aging desktop computer. They were looking for the synchronization software used by the GPS unit. If Rhett hadn't deleted the history, the software might retain a record of the data transferred to the device. The process was painstaking. The examiners had to navigate the cluttered hard drive, looking for the specific file formats and synchronization logs used by the Garmin software. The family waited, the silence broken only by the clicking of the keyboard and the whirring of the computer's fan. After several hours, deep within the application data folders, they found it, a synchronization log and cached map files. Rhett had indeed uploaded data to the GPS unit. He had programmed a series of waypoints and a detailed route just days before the disappearance. As the investigators analyzed the data and projected the route onto a topographical map of Vermont, the scope of the deception became clear. The route did not lead anywhere near the Green Mountain National Forest. The coordinates pointed to a destination radically different from the safe, populated campground they had described to their parents. The route led northeast toward one of the most remote, sparsely populated, and densely forested regions in the entire state, the Northeast Kingdom. The Northeast Kingdom of Vermont is a vast area known for its rugged beauty, isolation, and lack of infrastructure. It is a place where civilization gives way to dense boreal forests and rugged mountains. The specific coordinates Rhett had programmed were deep within this region, very close to the Canadian border. This was an area characterized by trackless wilderness, old logging roads, and terrain so difficult that few people ever ventured there. The discovery fundamentally altered the investigation. It confirmed that Rhett and Odessa had not simply gotten lost or had an accident near civilization. They had intentionally sought out extreme seclusion. They had planned meticulously to disappear into the wilderness. The implications were unsettling. Why would two 17-year-olds go to such lengths to hide their location? The selfie taken before they entered the deep woods showed them prepared for the cool weather. They knew what they were getting into. But what were they getting into? The search efforts immediately shifted focus to the Northeast Kingdom. But the challenge facing the search teams was immense. The area defined by the GPS data was massive, covering dozens of square miles of rugged mountainous terrain. The dense foliage made aerial observation nearly impossible, and the ground search was slow and treacherous. As the large-scale search operations mobilized in this new forbidding landscape, the family struggled to comprehend the deception. Sharon Conincade was devastated, grappling with the realization that her son had deliberately misled her. Jacqueline Vance was furious, her worst fears about the trip realized and amplified. The discovery of the hidden route had provided a location, but it had also deepened the mystery surrounding their disappearance. The vast, silent wilderness of the Northeast Kingdom held the answers, but it seemed determined to keep them. The autumn of 2018 progressed, the vibrant foliage fading to bare branches and the days growing shorter and colder. The intensive search efforts for Rhett Conincade and Odessa Vance in the Northeast Kingdom continued for weeks, but the rugged terrain and the sheer scale of the area thwarted every attempt to locate them. As the weather deteriorated, the large-scale operations were gradually scaled back. The case went cold. For the Conincade and Vance families, the passing months were an agonizing period of suspended animation. The lack of answers, combined with the knowledge that the teenagers were somewhere in that vast, silent wilderness, was a constant torment. The hope of finding them alive faded, replaced by a desperate need for closure. 3 months passed in this agonizing limbo. It was now mid-December 2018. Winter was approaching, but the heavy snows had not yet arrived in this specific region. The landscape was bleak and desolate, a monochromatic world of bare trees, damp fallen leaves, and cold gray skies. The breakthrough, when it came, was not the result of a dedicated search effort, but a chance encounter by someone accustomed to the isolation of the Northeast Kingdom. Wyatt Pendergast was a geological surveyor. He worked alone, contracted by the state, to map and assess old abandoned mining shafts scattered throughout the remote regions of Vermont. It was specialized work that required navigating difficult terrain far from any established trails. On this particular December day, Wyatt was working deep in the woods in the very region where Rhett and Odessa had vanished. He was miles from the nearest paved road, navigating the dense woods with a GPS unit and topographical maps. The air was still and cold, the ground covered with a thick layer of decaying brown leaves. He was focused on his survey grid, meticulously documenting the locations and conditions of the old shafts, remnants of a long-forgotten industrial past. The terrain was treacherous, slippery with mud and wet leaves. He was traversing a steep, heavily wooded slope, maneuvering around large boulders and fallen trees. He was slightly off his planned route, detouring around a difficult ravine when he stumbled upon something that didn't belong in the wilderness. In a small, relatively flat clearing, partially sheltered by a stand of dense pines, was a campsite. The sight was jarring. A small 2-person dome tent, faded yellow in color, sagged under the weight of accumulated debris and moisture. The fabric was stained with mud, grime, and mildew, indicating it had been exposed to the elements for a significant period. Wyatt approached cautiously. The campsite was clearly abandoned. The atmosphere was eerie, a silent testament to neglect. The ground around the tent was littered with crushed plastic water bottles scattered among the leaves. A makeshift fire pit, a simple circle of large gray rocks, was filled with cold gray ash, charred remnants of wood, and some litter. To the right of the tent, a makeshift clothesline was tied between 2 trees. Several pieces of dark, damp clothing hung limply from it. His initial thought was irritation. Illegal dumping was a persistent problem in these remote areas. It looked like someone had simply walked away from their entire setup, leaving their gear to rot. He documented the site with his camera, intending to report it to the authorities for cleanup. He pulled out his cell phone to call it in, but, as expected, there was no signal. He was too deep in the wilderness. He marked the coordinates on his GPS unit and prepared to hike back to his vehicle several miles away to make the call. The image of the desolate campsite stayed with him, unsettling in its stillness. It took him nearly 2 hours of strenuous hiking to reach his truck. He drove until he regained cell service and contacted the Vermont State Police. He reported the abandoned campsite, providing the precise coordinates and describing the discarded gear. The next day, a state trooper, Trooper Miller, was dispatched to investigate. He expected a routine littering case. The hike-in was long, the terrain muddy and difficult. When Trooper Miller arrived at the site, he saw the same scene of desolation that had unsettled Wyatt Pendergast. The air was gloomy and damp, the silence profound. He began processing the site, following the standard procedure for illegal dumping. He was looking for any identification so the state could issue a fine to the owner of the gear. He carefully unzipped the sagging tent, peeling back the damp fabric. Sleeping bags and other gear were strewn about inside, mildewed and decaying. He sifted through the discarded items, looking for anything with a name. In a small backpack near the entrance of the tent, he found a wallet. He opened it, expecting to find the ID of some careless camper. He pulled out the driver's license. The name on the license was Rhett Consincade. Trooper Miller froze. He stared at the license, the name instantly recognizable, the missing teenager, the case that had dominated local news 3 months ago. This wasn't just illegally dumped gear. This was the campsite of the 2 teenagers who had vanished in September. He immediately backed away from the tent, careful not to disturb anything further. He radioed for backup, his voice urgent. The remote, silent clearing was now a potential crime scene. A team of crime scene investigators arrived hours later. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. The desolate campsite was now the center of a meticulous forensic examination. The investigators systematically processed the scene, photographing every detail before disturbing the leaf-covered ground, the yellow tent, the fire pit, and the damp clothing on the line. They meticulously collected the discarded water bottles, the remnants of food packaging, and the gear inside the tent. The scene suggested that the camp had been abandoned abruptly, but there were no overt signs of a struggle within the immediate vicinity of the tent. The gear was all there. It didn't look like a robbery. Then, near the fire pit, partially obscured under a layer of decaying leaves and ash, an investigator spotted a flash of bright color. Using forceps, he carefully retrieved the item. It was a crinkled, empty package, slightly dirty. The packaging was bright green and yellow, featuring cartoonish gummy bear figures. The words Stony Patch were printed in large letters along with the phrase sour and sweet, then stoned. It was a package of high-potency cannabis edibles. This single piece of evidence immediately shifted the narrative of the disappearance. The discovery of the Stony Patch package suggested a reason why the teenagers had sought such extreme seclusion. They had come here to experiment, far from the prying eyes of parents and authorities. It painted a picture of typical teenage rebellion, a secret escapade into the wilderness. But it also raised immediate troubling questions. If they had consumed the edibles, their judgment and physical coordination would have been severely impaired. In this rugged terrain, that could have been disastrous. The discovery of the campsite was a major breakthrough, the first concrete evidence of Rhett and Odessa's whereabouts since they vanished. But the scene offered more questions than answers. The abandoned camp, the discarded gear, the empty drug package, it all suggested a story that had ended badly. But where were Rhett and Odessa? The discovery of the abandoned campsite in the remote wilderness of the Northeast Kingdom sent a shock wave through the small Vermont communities connected to the case. For the families of Rhett Consincade and Odessa Vance, the news was a devastating confirmation that the teenagers had indeed been in that forbidding landscape. But the specifics of the evidence found at the scene, particularly the Stony Patch edibles package, ignited a firestorm of speculation and conflict, fracturing the fragile alliance between the families. Jaqueline Vance, Odessa's mother, who had always harbored reservations about the trip and Odessa's relationship with Rhett, was consumed by a potent mix of grief and anger. The presence of high-potency cannabis edibles confirmed her worst fears about Rhett's influence on her daughter. In public statements and during interviews with investigators, Chquiline's grief manifested as accusation. She publicly blamed Rhett for the entire situation. She accused him of pressuring Odessa into taking the drugs, suggesting that his recklessness and desire for illicit experiences had led them into danger. Her narrative painted Rhett as the instigator, the one responsible for whatever tragedy had befallen them. The accusations didn't stop there. Chquiline even suggested the possibility that Rhett, while under the influence of the drugs, might have harmed Odessa. Perhaps they had argued. Perhaps he had become paranoid or aggressive in the throes of intoxication. The abandoned campsite, in her view, was evidence of his culpability, a scene of teenage tragedy fueled by poor judgment. Sharon Consincade, Rhett's mother, was devastated by these accusations. She fiercely defended her son, insisting that he would never hurt Odessa. Rhett, she maintained, was a caring and protective young man. The drugs, while concerning, didn't turn him into a monster. Sharon viewed the abandoned campsite differently. To her, the fact that all their gear was left behind suggested something more sinister than an accident or a drug-induced argument. It suggested an external threat, something that had interrupted their camping trip and forced them to flee or be taken. The conflict between the families played out publicly, fueled by media speculation and community gossip. The Stony Patch package became the central focus of the investigation, driving the prevailing theories about what had happened. The most prominent theory was that the couple had consumed the edibles, become severely intoxicated, and wandered off from the campsite. Impaired and disoriented in the rugged terrain, they could have easily gotten lost or injured. Another theory suggested that while intoxicated, they might have been attacked by wildlife. The Northeast Kingdom was home to black bears, coyotes, and other predators. Impaired teenagers would have been vulnerable, especially in late summer when bears are actively foraging. Others speculated about the possibility of encountering strangers in the woods. Despite the remoteness of the location, the area was occasionally used by hunters or others seeking isolation. Investigators, while aware of the emotional turmoil and public speculation, focused on the physical evidence. The campsite had been processed meticulously, but the immediate area yielded no human remains. The search now expanded outward from the campsite, looking for any sign of the teenagers, any clue as to their direction of travel. The terrain surrounding the clearing was steep and treacherous. A few days into the expanded search, investigators made a significant discovery that complicated the narrative of a simple accident. About 150 yards from the tent, near the edge of a steep rocky ravine, they found an object partially buried in the damp earth, obscured by fallen leaves. It was a pair of glasses. They were distinctive, with thin dark-colored frames and round lenses. Sharon Consincade immediately identified them as belonging to Rhett. The glasses were broken, the frame was snapped, and one lens was cracked. The location of the discovery was unsettling. It was far from the relative safety of the campsite, near a dangerous drop-off. The broken state of the glasses suggested a fall or perhaps a physical confrontation. If Rhett had fallen into the ravine, his remains might be concealed in the difficult terrain below. Search teams conducted a meticulous search of the ravine, rappelling down the steep slopes and combing the bottom, but they found nothing. No remains, no clothing, no further evidence. The broken glasses remained an isolated, ominous clue, suggesting a moment of violence or panic far from the campsite. While the search of the ravine was underway, another team of investigators was examining the wider area around the campsite, looking for access routes. The location was extremely remote, far from any established trails. How had Rhett and Odessa reached this spot? And had anyone else been there? About half a mile from the campsite, investigators located an old, heavily overgrown logging road. It was barely visible, unused for years, but it offered a potential access route into the area. In a patch of mud, where the soil was heavy with clay and had been protected from recent rains by an overhanging rock ledge, they found something crucial. They carefully cleared away a layer of accumulated fallen leaves, revealing the distinct impression beneath a set of tire tracks. The tracks were unusual. They did not match the tread pattern of Rhett's Jeep, which was still missing, nor did they match typical ATVs or trucks commonly used by hunters or loggers in the area. The tracks were narrower, and the tread pattern was unique and aggressive, suggesting a specialized or modified vehicle designed for navigating rough off-road terrain. The discovery of the tire tracks was a game changer. It introduced the possibility of a third party being present at or near the campsite. The preservation of the tracks suggested they had been made sometime before the heavy leaf fall of autumn, potentially around the time of the disappearance. The investigation now had two conflicting narratives. The drug paraphernalia suggested an accident, a teenage escapade gone wrong. But the broken glasses far from the camp and the mysterious tire tracks suggested something more sinister. Had they wandered off intoxicated, or had they been confronted by someone who arrived on that old logging road? The mystery deepened, the silence of the wilderness now feeling less like an empty void and more like a concealed threat. The investigation teetered between the conflicting implications of the evidence. The Stony Patch edibles strongly suggested misadventure, a tragic accident born of youthful recklessness. But the broken glasses near the ravine and the unidentified tire tracks hinted at foul play, a darker narrative lurking beneath the surface. With the physical search around the campsite yielding no further remains or clues, investigators decided to prioritize the drug angle, hoping it might reveal contacts or motives that explained the disappearance. Tracing the source of the cannabis edibles became a primary objective. In 2018, while cannabis laws were beginning to loosen, the high-potency commercially packaged edibles like Stony Patch were still largely illicit in Vermont, especially for minors. Investigators needed to find out where Rhett had acquired them. They conducted discreet interviews with the couple's close friends and acquaintances. Rhett and Odessa were generally considered good kids, not known to be heavily involved in the local drug scene. However, like many teenagers, they were curious and experimental. After several interviews, characterized by hesitation and fear of getting into trouble, a name emerged. The name belonged to a local small-time dealer, a young adult known for selling cannabis products to high school students. He operated on the fringes, keeping a low profile, but his reputation was known among the local youth. He became a primary person of interest. If he had supplied the edibles, he might know more about Rhett's plans for the weekend, or perhaps he had a motive to follow them into the wilderness. Police brought the dealer in for questioning. The interrogation room was small and airless. Initially resistant and defensive, the dealer eventually realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about selling weed, it was about two missing teenagers. Under sustained pressure, he admitted to selling the Stony Patch edibles to Rhett a few days before the camping trip. The investigators pressed him for details. Did Rhett mention where they were going? Why did they need such high-potency products? The dealer, now eager to distance himself from the disappearance, revealed an unusual detail that immediately captured the investigators' full attention. Rhett had been unusually specific about their need for extreme seclusion. He mentioned that he and Odessa were looking for a very remote spot, not just for privacy, but because they were planning to meet someone. According to the dealer, Rhett said they had connected with someone online who promised them a unique off-grid experience. This revelation hit the investigators like an electric shock. It provided a potential explanation for why the teenagers had chosen such a remote location in the Northeast Kingdom and why they had deceived their parents. It also introduced a dangerous new element, an unknown individual who had potentially lured them into the wilderness. The investigation shifted immediately and decisively to this new lead. The off-grid experience suggested a connection to survivalist or alternative lifestyle communities, which were known to exist in the remote regions of Vermont. Investigators dived into Rhett's and Odessa's digital lives, scouring their social media accounts, emails, and browsing histories recovered from their home computers. They discovered that Rhett had been increasingly active on obscure online forums dedicated to backcountry survival, homesteading, and off-grid living. He had been researching techniques for long-term wilderness survival, sustainable living, and evading detection. It appeared he was fascinated, perhaps obsessed, by the idea of disconnecting from society. In one of these forums, investigators identified a user who had been communicating frequently with Rhett in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. The user's profile was anonymous, but their posts were charismatic and persuasive, advocating for a radical rejection of modern society and promoting a secretive communal lifestyle deep in the wilderness. The communication between Rhett and this user suggested plans to meet. The user claimed to be part of a small established community living off the grid in the Northeast Kingdom and offered to guide Rhett and Odessa into this hidden sanctuary. The coordinates programmed into the borrowed GPS unit matched the general area described by the user. This seemed like a major break. The narrative was compelling and terrifying. Two impressionable teenagers fascinated by the idea of an alternative lifestyle, lured into the wilderness by a charismatic online contact. Perhaps they had joined this community voluntarily. Or perhaps the community was something more sinister, a cult or a criminal enterprise. The investigation poured resources into identifying the anonymous user. A team of digital forensic experts worked around the clock, attempting to trace the user's digital footprint. The excitement was palpable. They felt they were on the verge of solving the case, perhaps even finding the teenagers alive in this hidden community. But the trail was frustratingly elusive. The user was sophisticated in their use of technology, employing VPNs, encrypted messaging apps, and complex layers of anonymity to mask their identity and location. The IP addresses associated with the user's activity were constantly shifting, leading investigators on a digital wild goose chase across international servers. Weeks turned into a month. The intensive digital forensics continued, but the trail went cold. The user profile on the forum was suddenly deleted. All communication ceased. The lead, which had seemed so promising, evaporated into the digital ether. Investigators were faced with a crushing realization. They might have been dealing with a sophisticated catfish, someone who enjoyed the power play of luring people online but never intended to meet in person. Or perhaps the user had panicked when the disappearance became a major news story and erased their digital tracks. The off-grid experience lead was ultimately determined to be a dead end. It had wasted crucial investigative time and resources, diverting attention from the physical evidence found at the campsite. The frustration among the investigators was immense. The collapse of this lead forced them back to the beginning, back to the cold reality of the abandoned campsite, the broken glasses, and the mysterious tire tracks. If they hadn't been lured there by an online contact, why had they chosen that specific remote location? And what had happened to them? The mystery surrounding the disappearance of Rhett and Odessa deepened, the silence of the wilderness echoing the silence of the digital trail. With the seductive theory of the off-grid experience debunked and the digital trail vanishing into an anonymous void, the investigation was forced to retreat from the virtual world and refocus on the tangible physical evidence collected near the campsite. The broken glasses remained a haunting anomaly, suggesting violence or accident. But it was the unusual tire tracks found on the overgrown logging road that held the most potential for a breakthrough. The tracks were the only concrete evidence suggesting the presence of a third party, a presence that remained unexplained. Investigators focused on identifying the vehicle that made those tracks. The photographs and castings of the tread pattern had been circulated widely among law enforcement agencies and vehicle experts, but no match had been found in standard databases. The narrow width and unique tread pattern remained stubbornly unidentifiable. However, the location of the campsite, deep in the Northeast Kingdom and very close to the Canadian border, prompted investigators to consider less conventional possibilities. This region of Vermont was known for its porous border, a vast wilderness crisscrossed by unofficial trails and old logging roads used for decades by smugglers moving illicit goods between the U.S. and Canada. The border here was often little more than a cut line through the dense forest, difficult to monitor and easy to cross undetected. Investigators decided to consult with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. CBP agents patrolling this remote sector had specialized knowledge of the terrain and the methods used by smuggling operations. A meeting was convened, and the investigators presented the evidence of the tire tracks, hoping the agents' expertise might provide a new perspective. The CBP agents analyzed the photos and castings. Their assessment was immediate and decisive. They recognized the tread pattern. It was not a standard commercial vehicle. Instead, it was consistent with a specific type of utility vehicle, often modified with specialized tires used by sophisticated smuggling operations to navigate the rugged, unofficial crossings between Vermont and Quebec. These vehicles were chosen for their durability, their narrow profile, allowing them to access trails too small for trucks, and their ability to carry significant cargo while maintaining a low profile. This identification was a watershed moment. It fundamentally shifted the focus of the investigation from a localized incident, an accident, or a random act of violence, to potential cross-border criminal activity. The disappearance of Rhett and Odessa might be connected to the clandestine world of international smuggling. The implication was chilling. Had the teenagers inadvertently stumbled upon a smuggling operation in progress? Had they chosen a campsite directly on an active smuggling route? If so, the people involved would be dangerous, organized, and motivated to eliminate any witnesses. Authorities began analyzing patterns of illegal crossings and smuggling activity in the region around the time of the disappearance in September. They reviewed sensor data, aerial surveillance footage, and intelligence reports related to smuggling networks operating in the Northeast Kingdom. But the wilderness was vast, and the smuggling operations were sophisticated, designed to evade detection. Connecting a specific smuggling event to the disappearance of the teenagers proved difficult. The investigation stalled again. The scope now widened to international crime, but the leads remained frustratingly elusive. Months passed. Winter came and went, and the investigation remained active, albeit cold. It was now the summer of 2019. The case of Rhett and Odessa had faded from the headlines. The initial urgency was replaced by a lingering sense of mystery. Then, an unrelated tip came into the Burlington Police Department, over 100 miles away from the Northeast Kingdom. The tip came not from an informant or a witness, but from a utility worker doing his routine rounds. The worker was servicing a large, aging apartment complex in a working-class neighborhood of Burlington. His job involved checking meters and ensuring the infrastructure was functioning correctly. While conducting his rounds, he noticed an anomaly regarding one specific unit on the third floor that struck him as highly suspicious. The observation was logged in his report. The utility worker noted that the apartment's windows were completely blacked out from the inside, not with curtains or blinds, but with heavy industrial-grade plastic sheeting taped securely to the frames, blocking all light and visibility. It looked like the occupant was trying to ensure absolute privacy or perhaps conceal something inside. Furthermore, the worker noted that the unit's electricity usage was abnormally high. It was disproportionate to the size of the apartment, suggesting that equipment was running constantly, perhaps grow lights, heavy-duty ventilation systems, or other high-consumption devices. The combination of the blacked-out windows and the high electricity usage was a red flag, often associated with illicit activities like indoor cannabis cultivation or makeshift labs. The tip was initially categorized as a potential narcotics issue. Burlington PD logged the information, intending to follow up when resources allowed. In a busy city, such reports were common. However, the report eventually crossed the desk of a state police detective still working the Cade Vance case. He was engaged in the tedious task of cross-referencing suspicious activity reports from across the state with intelligence related to the smuggling networks identified by CBP. He was looking for individuals connected to these networks, people living transient or secretive lifestyles. The report from the Burlington apartment complex caught his attention. The blacked-out windows and the high electricity usage suggested a level of secrecy that resonated with the clandestine nature of smuggling operations. He decided to look into the tenant of the blacked-out apartment. The connection was tenuous, a long shot based on a generalized profile. But in a case with no active leads, every anomaly was worth investigating. The focus of the investigation shifted dramatically from the vast wilderness of the Northeast Kingdom to a single enigmatic apartment in the heart of Burlington. The utility worker's tip provided a sudden, unexpected focus for the sprawling investigation. The blacked-out apartment in Burlington was a stark contrast to the trackless wilderness of the Northeast Kingdom, but the sense of concealment and the aura of secrecy were the same. Investigators began digging into the identity of the tenant in the third-floor unit. The apartment was leased to a man named Ivan Zorik. A background check revealed that Zorik was a recent immigrant originally from Eastern Europe. He had a sparse work history in the U.S., mostly transient labor jobs, and kept a very low profile. He had no significant criminal record in the United States, suggesting he was either careful or new to the area. However, when investigators cross-referenced his name with international databases and the intelligence provided by CBP regarding cross-border smuggling networks, an alarming picture began to emerge. Zorik had suspected connections to Eastern European organized crime syndicates. These organizations were known for their sophistication, brutality, and involvement in various illicit activities, including drug trafficking, weapon smuggling, and, most disturbingly, human trafficking across the Canadian border. The connection was still circumstantial, but the profile fit perfectly. A man linked to international smuggling networks living in a secretive, blacked-out apartment with abnormally high electricity usage in a state known for its porous border. The possibility that this was connected to the disappearance of Rhett and Odessa, who vanished near a known smuggling route, became too compelling to ignore. Authorities placed the apartment complex under tight surveillance. A team of undercover officers monitored the building 24/7, tracking Zorek's movements. The surveillance operation was difficult and tedious. The apartment complex was densely populated, and Zorek was clearly cautious, perhaps even paranoid. They observed Zorek coming and going at erratic hours, often late at night. He was always alone. He drove a nondescript sedan, but investigators noted he changed vehicles frequently, utilizing rental cars and borrowed vehicles. He exhibited classic counter-surveillance behavior, doubling back on his routes, stopping abruptly to check if he was being followed, and scanning the area constantly before entering or exiting the building. He was a professional, someone who knew how to evade detection. The surveillance continued for weeks. Investigators needed more concrete evidence to obtain a search warrant. They monitored his interactions, his purchases, and his garbage. They noted that he frequently brought large quantities of food and supplies into the apartment, seemingly more than one person could consume, yet he never had visitors. The apartment remained sealed, a silent enigma. The evidence mounted that the apartment was being used for illicit activity. The connection to the smuggling route near the campsite, combined with Zorek's background and his paranoid behavior, painted a terrifying picture. The urgency to enter the apartment grew, driven by the faint but horrifying possibility that the missing teenagers might be connected to this criminal enterprise. Based on the accumulated circumstantial evidence and Zorek's links to organized crime, the police obtained a high-risk search warrant. Given Zorek's suspected connections and the potential danger involved, the decision was made to execute the warrant using a tactical team. The raid was scheduled for the early morning hours when the complex was quiet and the element of surprise was greatest. The atmosphere was electric as the tactical team assembled outside the building. The stakes were incredibly high. They didn't know what they would find inside that blacked-out apartment, a drug lab, a weapons cache, or something far worse. The team moved swiftly and silently through the hallways of the apartment complex, converging on Zorek's unit. They positioned themselves outside the door, weapons drawn, the tension palpable. The breach was explosive. The team used a battering ram to force open the reinforced door, the sound of splintering wood and metal echoing through the quiet building. They stormed into the apartment, shouting commands, moving with practiced precision through the dimly lit interior. Ivan Zorek was found in the main living area, startled and enraged by the sudden intrusion. He resisted arrest violently, fighting with the officers with unexpected strength and ferocity. It took several officers to subdue him and place him in handcuffs. He remained defiant, shouting threats and struggling against the restraints. The apartment itself was unsettling. The main living area was sparse, almost empty, smelling faintly of stale food and strong disinfectant. The windows were indeed covered with thick black plastic, casting the apartment into perpetual darkness. The high electricity usage was partially explained by a sophisticated ventilation system humming loudly, seemingly designed to filter the air and maintain a controlled environment. But there were no signs of a grow operation. The tactical team began a systematic search of the apartment. The kitchen and the living room yielded nothing of immediate significance. They moved to the bedrooms. The first bedroom was empty, apparently used as Zorek's sparse sleeping quarters. The second bedroom was different. The door was heavily reinforced, fitted with multiple external locks and soundproofing material. It was immediately clear that this door was designed not to keep people out, but to keep something or someone in. The sense of dread was palpable. The officers prepared to breach this second door. They didn't know what awaited them on the other side. The anticipation was agonizing. They forced the door open. The room inside was small, dark, and suffocating. The ventilation system was loudest here. The smell was horrific, a mix of human waste, sweat, and fear. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single harsh overhead light, they found her, Odessa Vance. She was alive, but barely recognizable. She was severely malnourished, her skin pale and bruised, her blonde hair matted and dirty. She was physically restrained, chained to a heavy metal fixture bolted to the floor. She was huddled in a corner, trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with terror and disbelief at the sudden appearance of the tactical team. The shock of the discovery reverberated through the officers. After nearly a year of searching and fearing the worst, Odessa had been found, hidden in plain sight in the heart of Burlington, a prisoner in a soundproofed cell. The scene was horrific. The room was meticulously designed to hold a captive indefinitely, a testament to Zorich's depravity. The realization of what she had endured over the past year was devastating. Medical personnel were immediately called to the scene. They carefully approached Odessa, speaking in calm, reassuring tones. She was deeply traumatized, barely responsive. They administered first aid and prepared to transport her to the hospital. Ivan Zorich, now subdued and in custody, remained silent, his eyes cold and defiant. The raid had rescued Odessa, a miraculous outcome in a case defined by tragedy. But the fate of Rhett Kincaid remained unknown. The horror found in that soundproofed room was only half the story. Odessa Vance was rushed to the University of Vermont Medical Center, where she received intensive medical and psychiatric care. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from the profound physical and psychological trauma of nearly a year of captivity and abuse. It would be several days before she was strong enough to speak with investigators to begin articulating the horrors she had endured. When she was finally able to recount the ordeal, the story she told was harrowing. She explained that she and Rhett had reached the remote campsite in the Northeast Kingdom as planned in September. They had set up the tent, started a fire, and, seeking the privacy and adventure they desired, consumed the Stony Patch edibles. As the drugs took effect, their perception altered, and they became relaxed and impaired, vulnerable in the isolation of the wilderness. They were completely unaware that they were not alone. They were ambushed. Ivan Zorich emerged from the woods suddenly, armed and aggressive. Odessa explained that Zorich, who was using that remote section of the woods for his active smuggling route between Canada and the U.S., had stumbled upon their camp purely by chance. Seeing the vulnerable teenagers, he saw an opportunity. Zorich attacked them. Rhett, despite being impaired, reacted instantly, attempting to fight back and protect Odessa. They struggled violently. It was during this confrontation near the ravine that Rhett's glasses were knocked off and broken, but he was no match for Zorich's brutality. Odessa witnessed the unimaginable. Zorich overpowered and killed Rhett. After the murder, Zorich abducted Odessa. He used his modified utility vehicle, the source of the mysterious tire tracks, to transport her out of the wilderness via the old logging road. He took her directly to the Burlington apartment, which he had already prepared as a secure location. Odessa revealed Zorich's intentions. He was part of a larger human trafficking network. His plan was to hold her captive, break her spirit, and eventually smuggle her across the border into Canada, where she would be sold. Under intense interrogation, Ivan Zorich recognized the overwhelming weight of the evidence against him. Faced with Odessa's testimony and the discovery of the prison cell in his apartment, he confessed. He admitted to the abduction of Odessa and the murder of Rhett Kincaid. However, when investigators pressed him for the location of Rhett's body, Zorich's cooperation ceased abruptly. He stopped talking, offering an obvious, dismissive lie. He claimed he didn't remember what he did with the remains. Ivan Zorich was charged with murder, kidnapping, and human trafficking. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Odessa Vance began the long, arduous process of recovery. Rhett Kincaid's body was never recovered, his final resting place remaining a secret held by the vast wilderness of the Northeast Kingdom.